I wanted to start this morning with a word of thanks. This is my first time to join you for worship, but it's not my first time here. 18 years ago, your church was there for my family at a really important time, and it was a place for my mother to come to PFLAG meetings. So I really appreciate that that was something you found important and that you offered to the community. So thank you so much. A recently viral TikTok video ranted that injustice, victimhood, and harm now function as forms of cultural currency, a scarce commodity, unevenly distributed and more scarce for some than others. Victimhood can seem to empower some to speak more loudly, with more authority on some of the most pressing questions that we all ask. Who are we? What are we becoming? How can our lives affect meaningful change? This chase for the privilege of injustice has many names. I like to call it the Oppression Olympics. It's a game that has the tagline, where everyone loses. Establishing who in a room is the most oppressed might seem to have real function, but the absurdity becomes clear when we try to conceptualize the privilege of injustice. It's a fetishization of injustice that is exploited by those who centralize their power to their identity. And in so doing, they forget everything else important about themselves. For the outside observer, identity is used shamelessly as an alibi. These are the folks who feel threatened by the oppression of another. And these are the people who play the Oppression Olympics out of desperate fear that losing power is a loss of identity. If we were to name examples, white nationalists' replacement theory, or men's rights rhetoric. But more importantly, the privilege of injustice is also a complete illusion, because empowerment by itself isn't the solution to injustice. Paulo Freire, in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, observed that power given to the oppressed tends to fashion the next generation of oppressors. In post-colonial language, we could call this the colonized colonizer. It's a perversion to think that justice is served when history's victimized loser becomes the victimizing winner, like the story of the Hebrew slaves becoming genocidal conquerors in the Exodus Joshua story, or the tragedy that is still unfolding right before our eyes following the murder of Tyree Nichols in Memphis. Freire would go on to suggest that humanization is the condition which stands in opposition to oppression. And though it includes justice, it goes beyond the traditional requirements of justice. The gold standard for classical justice comes from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. It sets out a dual standard of lawfulness and fairness. In material terms, it looks at a distribution of goods that's proportional to our worth. Working towards justice might look like the old adage of invoking the image of a feast, where those with full plates take less so that the distribution of food can be more equitable for all. But Freire viewed attempts by the powerful to willfully lessen their privilege as a false generosity that's ultimately reluctant to overturn the structures underpinning an unjust system. Observing human nature, he wrote that we who give to those who are less fortunate often are prone to like the warm, fuzzy feeling of giving. We start to over-identify with our benevolence, our magnanimity. It's an instinct not too different from those who essentialize power with identity, except we're doing benevolence with identity. And so we're reluctant to ever actually attack the systemic inequality that feeds our abundance, the unjust social order that makes it so that we have excess from which to share. So we see this play out in the structural failure of modern nonprofit charities. It doesn't matter what the particular cause is. I'm a master sommelier. That means that I often get called to volunteer at charity galas. Maybe you've seen me at some local events. I'm usually the guy pouring wine. And of course, I'm very polite. When I'm talking about food and wine pairings, after all, my job is to make a pleasant evening for people who can afford a $1,000 seat. But inside, I'm sad, because charity that is dependent on the beneficence of wealthy patrons will never be able to critique the fundamental wealth inequality that causes the problems that the charity is working to solve. We follow the prevailing wisdom, never bite the hand that feeds you, or it is more blessed to give than to receive. But looking from the bottom up, of course, those who can give are the ones who have been blessed more than those who have to hold out their hands to receive. When I was in seminary, I once asked my mentor, the pastor of a large established, can I say Presbyterian congregation? Why he chose an alternate biblical passage when the lectionary assigned the story in the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus tells a rich ruler that he should sell all that he has because the wealthy do not inherit the kingdom of God. My mentor's answer was prompt and devoid of irony. I'd lose my job if I preached that passage. In contrast to the false generosity of philanthropy and other social band-aids, true generosity is exactly the fight against the social order that generates wealth, the fight that makes charity unnecessary. True generosity is also by itself insufficient for the humanization of those who suffer injustice. If I were to summarize, justice contributes to humanization when it is encountered alongside love. But humanization starts not with benevolence from the powerful. It's a process, it's a praxis that originates in the agency of those who suffer injustice. It asks what causes injustice, and how can we, those who are most affected by injustice, authentically become their whole selves, not the divided self that still yearns for a piece of the action to dominate. The good news for all of us today, doesn't matter which side of the power divide we're on, is that this is not a story like the historical revolutions that have left inequality in place, but simply switched the roles between the oppressor and the oppressed. Humanization liberates both those who suffer and those who perpetuate injustice. My point in this long-winded introduction, I'm still in the introduction, is to explain my motivation for explaining justice from the perspective of those who suffer injustice. I mean to privilege this viewpoint without fetishization, without perpetuating the oppression Olympics. There is nothing noble about suffering injustice. No one would actually suffer, who actually suffers would ever willingly choose to suffer. On the other hand, who is better prepared than those who suffer injustice to understand the significance of an unjust society? Who can better define liberation than those who seek it for their own survival? And since those of us who, because of our privilege, don't really experience the full weight of systemic injustice, we're unable to work for those who experience injustice, really. Our task is instead to work with those who experience injustice, not to teach ourselves about injustice, but to learn from those who experience injustice as they critically reflect on their own experience. Just in case I've overstepped my role and you're tempted to flee, let me summarize my conclusions. What I've learned from those who experience injustice is that humanization, the quest for justice, is not to be found in the balancing of scales or proportional divisions of wealth. Those who ask questions about justice receive answers in the language of undeserved, unmerited love. Not just an intellectual or heartfelt love, but of intimacy, of longing, which encompasses the whole spectrum of the human experience, of embodied love. So my plan is to use two texts for this examination, two stories of people who suffer horribly in the Judeo-Christian tradition. There are a lot of them, admittedly. Job and Eve, to see what ancient wisdom can be found in their experience of injustice. So I hope you ask for your indulgence. The disclaimer is that my reflection on these texts is mostly anthropological and ethical rather than theological. I was warned, actually. Thank you very much, Marianne. The most intimidating thing a Christian minister can hear on that first phone call is, we're not Christians. And the inner narrative is, I'm not sure I am either. Sometimes the installation of a Sunday service makes talk of tackling systemic injustice a little too safe. Actual despair obscures the line between cause and effect, magnifying the impersonal horror of powerlessness. When my job evaporated at the beginning of the pandemic, it seemed arbitrary that the system was designed for W-2 wage earners, not hybrid 1099 freelancers like myself. And daily calls to the unemployment office inevitably resulted in the reminder that yet again, call volume exceeded capacity and goodbye. I learned that I didn't like being entirely helpless. I suspect that neither did the central character from the book of Job. In the story preceding our selection, we were going to have selections up on the screens, but I didn't want to bury you in text. So the way the story goes is that Job gives voice to our bewilderment about injustice. How can anyone hold hope in the possibility of a just future when life seems so arbitrary, poverty so unfair? In this story, Job is the innocent victim of a bet between Hasatan, the adversary, who we call Satan, and Hashem, like God. God surrenders Job for torment to test whether humanity believes in justice only when surrounded by privilege and curses justice when crushed by misery. This is probably not the burning question that interrupts our sleep, but I do wonder, when I feel helpless before Jim Crow or environmental collapse, wealth gap, is there any hope for justice? But Job doesn't only have to suffer divine capriciousness. Job has to suffer his friends, who mock him with their own explanation of his fortune. Bad things happen to bad people. It's karma. Job rejects this theory of retribution as justice, and instead Job does something we should pay attention to. Job affirms his innocence and reclaims agency over his identity in the face of slander. So he's critically reflecting on injustice. As Paulo Freire would say, so Job defines his own humanization and rejects the identity imposed by the oppressor. Job examines the cause of suffering and concludes that poverty isn't fated or arbitrary. Looking beyond his own misery to the suffering of orphans, the starving, the naked, is the seed of solidarity and compassion, one antidote for the isolation of despair. Job realizes that poverty is neither deserved nor arbitrary. It is inflicted by those who say to God, "Go away." That is, anyone who rejects the ways of justice. And Job, despite his own misery, pleads to God in solidarity with all innocent people who suffer unjustly. The importance of the story is not contingent on a belief in God. People like Job who suffer injustice teach us the importance of solidarity. And for those of us that don't really suffer injustice all that much, solidarity is important for an additional reason. The Jesuit martyr Ignacio Ellacuría, fantastic thinker, wrote that the location where reality makes itself most present is the world of the poor. The majority of humanity is poor. The poor bear the weight of the decisions we make here in the global north with greatest brutality. Therefore, the poor clarify the reality of the world, and their experience defines the ethical demands on us. One cannot know the truth of the world, Ellacuría says, outside the world of the poor. So to those of us who aren't poor, that's a statement that can knock the wind out of us. But consider all the knowledge, the education, the security, the access to healthcare, the freedom that our wealth affords us. Ellacuría reminds us that our wealth impoverishes our perception of reality. When we think that our comfortable way of living is the way that things should be. For example, did you know it would require 2.5 Earths for 7 billion people to have the same quality of life as the average American? So that's not about political will. That's a physical law. There simply isn't enough energy. So our way of life is literally unsustainable as a fantasy that can never be the reality for all of humanity. The more we normalize our consumption as Americans, the more we lose touch with reality. Yes, the poor suffer immensely, but they do not suffer the same delusion of wealth that we do. So Job and Elakria offer us a way out of our participation with injustice, our delusion, by centering the experience of those who suffer as the reality of what it means to be human, a mindset of solidarity with those who suffer injustice. The experience of injustice also answers our fundamental question about the character and the possibility of justice. The indigenous Peruvian priest Gustavo Gutierrez, a foundational thinker in liberation thought, points to Job's response to a natural disaster that kills all of his children. Job calls out, "Naked I came from my mother, naked I shall return again. God gave, God has taken back. Blessed be the name of God." Gutierrez notes an undercurrent in Job's words that is familiar to all oppressed people, which he describes as not a mere resignation. There is something deeper here that an enlightened faith finds difficult to put a finger on. A truth that is plainly obvious to people who own very few things and rarely experience much control over their lives. There is a release from entitlement, an awareness that wholeness is independent from control or power over others and circumstances. The need for power and control will always be sources of suffering, not sources of humanization. So we choose what is freely given instead of an obsession over what is owed. This is not a repudiation of the quest for justice. When Job asks God why he has suffered so much, God responds, "Where were you at the moment of creation? Can you command Behemoth or Leviathan?" This reply is one of the most perplexing, obscure, opaque references in the whole Bible. But that's because the reply highlights the problem with any demand for divine justice. When we are asked, where were we at the moment of creation, we are reminded that even the act of creation itself was unmerited, regardless of how we understand that we got here today. In perhaps the most breathtaking sentence of the whole dialogue, God invokes the image of rain rolling down in the desert, where it is of no benefit to any human. But the beauty of grass in a barren land serves to delight God. It reminds us that human relationships are not built out of balance sheets. In the worldview of this text, Job's suffering reveals the reality that we, who did not exist at the moment of God's Spirit hovered over the primordial waters, could not have done anything to deserve the love which lies at the foundation of the world. So, if all creation exists as the free gift of God's love, justice has a hard time making a claim about exactly what God owes to us. So when we ask questions about the why of suffering, when we ask if justice is even possible, we are given one possible answer in the language of love. Our relationship to the Creator also informs our relationships with one another. It is easy to see justice and love at work in the relationships which are most precious and meaningful to us: parent, partner, child, friend. They all feel, really rarely do they feel deserved. They're each flavored with the gratitude proper to a gift, which is a sign of the love that infuses these bonds. And by contrast, there is rarely anything of love in a relationship of oppression. But the lack of love in a relationship of injustice highlights, if anything, the need. As those of privilege, our contribution to justice isn't merely a solidarity informed by the experience of the oppressed. Our work requires a love that sees an individual as more than a category and puts aside pious, paternalistic gestures to the extent that we enter into the position of the one with whom we seek solidarity. So after Job receives Yahweh's answer, Job's reply is, "Now my eyes see you, therefore I repent of dust and ashes." God reveals a reality built on unmerited love, and this causes Job to turn away from desperation about his suffering. He repents of his season of mourning and self-pity, the dust and the ashes, to gaze instead at the reality of God's goodness. Gutierrez's comment on that is that the truth he has grasped is that justice alone does not have the final say. Only when we come to realize that God's love is freely bestowed do we enter fully and definitively into the presence of faith. If we unravel the story of creation a bit further, we found another story similar to Job's that lies quietly beneath a text that we often take for granted as speaking in only the one way about the nature of justice. The Genesis account of the fall of Adam and Eve uses the eating of forbidden fruit to derive a doctrine of sin, guilt, atonement, doctrines that infect many of our assumptions about who we are to the present day. But I want to suggest a retelling of that story. The departure begins when we look at God's first reaction after the fruit is consumed. If the writers of Genesis had intended the origin of sin, justifying the need for continual temple sacrifice or Christological divine atonement, God's response to the sinful act would have been one of reaction. It would have been, "What have you done?" Right? That's what we say when a kid, whatever. This is the language of guilt that follows improper action. But justice is rarely the remedy for transgressive action. Justice is the remedy for transgressive action. But this is not the question that God asks in the moment of shock while God is clutching God's pearls. In verse 9, God's first question is actually one of broken intimacy, of longing, and not of judgment. God asks not, "What have you done?" God asks, anyone? God asks, "Where are you?" So the theologian Jay Johnson points out that this isn't the language of guilt in response to action. It's the language of shame, specifically bodily shame. And it flows from the embarrassment over Adam and Eve's naked bodies, resulting in a broken relationship between God and humanity. As human history unfolded, this shame has taken on more toxic forms: alienation, isolation, violence, aggression. It isn't a far journey to begin with shame and to end at racism or war or misogyny. Our court system attempts to achieve justice by assessing punishment as a repayment of societal debt for actions that break social norms. But our justice system isn't up to the task of actually repairing relationships between survivor and perpetrator. Similarly, in the Bible, actions of atonement for sinful action don't repair the broken relationship between God and humanity. Throughout the biblical narrative, humanity relates to the divine in the pattern of defiance and embarrassment that recalls the original shame of Adam and Eve. To further drive the point home, the temptation that the serpent uses to instigate the fall was the implication that Eve was not, as she was created, sufficient. Don't you want to be more than what you are? Don't you know that you're not good enough? Don't you want to be like God, is what the serpent asks. And so from the beginning of this episode, it's about broken or misunderstood identity and the shame that follows. So if I can ask you to imagine these texts as sacred stories that make meaning of the human condition, I'd like to reinterpret the story of sin and shame from the Garden of Eden all the way through the life of Jesus of Nazareth as a narrative of solidarity. If injustice and oppression result in perverted identities, oppression becomes seen as, the oppressed becomes seen as objects to be controlled. And if the demand of justice and love together as solidarity ask that we enter into the position with one who suffers from a broken understanding of their own humanity, then perhaps we can think of the story of incarnation in which God becomes human, loving us so much that God becomes like us in body as an act of solidarity, as Jesus entering into our position as human beings. This solidarity affirms that we are worthy of love, of loving ourselves instead of experiencing shame in our humanity. So the incarnation is not a story about retribution or judicial atonement, as most Christians think. It's a story about humanization. It restores and affirms our bodily identity, healing our shame through unconditional love and embrace. So even in the foundational moment which defines the moral relationship between God and humanity, we see a narrative in which the requirements of justice are answered in the language of freely given love for our bodies. But the salient point for today is to remember that divine love will always point us rightly back to our task to take care of one another as we are in bodily form, to feed, to clothe, to heal. So my invitation today, this morning, is to search beyond the traditional legalism of justice, to not it's not to make light of our heartfelt call to make a difference in the world, but the challenge before us is to resist the defensiveness when our privilege is challenged. It's to embrace and center the experiences of people different than ourselves. It's to expand the possibilities of our engagement beyond paternalistic charity. And it's to surrender the safety of distant benevolence. In exchange, we are called to the promise of relationships of solidarity for the humanization of those who suffer and the promise of our own liberation.